She asked only for the crust that had fallen, nothing more, but his refusal cut deeper than hunger. In a world bound by pride and class, what begins as a moment of cold dismissal becomes the spark that unravels years of silence, shame, and unspoken longing. As tenderness grows where contempt once lived, two souls from opposite worlds must decide if love can truly rise from the dust. A story of quiet defiance, slow redemption, and a question that was never really about bread. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The morning air clung with mist, as if the town itself had not yet fully awakened. Val-sur-Loire, a quiet provincial village tucked into a curve of the Loire River, exhaled the damp breath of early spring. The cobbled streets glistened faintly with the residue of night rain, and the stone facades of the buildings held the chill like secret grudges. Beneath the shadow of the church steeple, market stalls groaned under the weight of baskets, crates, bolts of fabric, and bundled herbs. Merchants arranged their goods with an anxious sort of precision, glancing now and again toward the main road that wound in from the east. He would arrive soon. There was a hush of tension in the square, not loud or urgent, but collective and unmistakable. Not fear, exactly, though for some that played a part, but curiosity honed by years of distance. The townspeople stood straighter. They wore cleaner coats, tied ribbons in their daughters' hair, brushed the dust from their aprons. Even the bread cart, with its long loaves and burnished crusts, was adorned with sprigs of early lavender. They knew how to receive a noble. Count Lucien d'Arsac was returning to town. The d'Arsac family had owned nearly every inch of land surrounding Val-sur-Loire for centuries. Vineyards, mills, orchards, and the chateau itself, which rose on the hill like a monument carved out of pride. The Count had not visited the town in many months, preferring the quiet administration of his estate from a distance. But this week, he had sent word. He would arrive before noon, attend the mayor's council, and inspect the new repairs made to the bridge crossing the river. Elise Marchand stood beneath the lip of an old awning near the square, watching as the crowd shifted in anticipation. Her hands were red and damp from scrubbing linen at the river earlier that morning. She held them close to her chest, fingers curling slightly from the ache. She wore a dull, mended dress the color of wet ash, the skirt hem darkened and stiff where it had soaked up water from the street. Her shawl was too thin for the lingering cold, but it was all she owned, save for the patched apron tied at her waist. Her shoes had given out weeks ago. Her bare feet pressed against the uneven stones, aching from the cold and the effort of standing. Her stomach twisted with hunger. She had not eaten since the previous morning, a crust of boiled potato and a few bitter greens left from the market refuse. Her mother lay fevered in their attic room, sweating through linen soaked with vinegar and stale herbs. Elise had whispered goodbye to her just before dawn, pressing a cool cloth to her brow and promising, though she did not know how, that she would find something to eat that day, or something to sell, or beg if she had to. She hated the thought. A rumble stirred in the street like a warning. The horses appeared first, sleek and dark with polished harnesses that shone in the weak sunlight. Then the carriage, deep green with gold trim, the d'Arsac crest embossed on the side like a brand. The townspeople drew back as it pulled into the square, the sound of hooves striking stone echoing off the shop fronts. The driver reined in the horses smoothly, and from the interior, a tall figure stepped down with the air of someone long accustomed to obedience. Count Lucien d'Arsac wore a tailored coat of midnight blue, buttoned to the throat, his cravat tied with clean precision. His dark hair was neatly swept back from his brow, his boots polished to mirror shine. He carried no hat, no gloves, no cane, nothing that would signal leisure. He did not smile. He did not bow. He surveyed the square with a distant, calculating gaze, as though measuring the strength of mortar in the walls and the angle of shadows on the ground. Elise watched him with a strange sense of detachment, her hunger momentarily forgotten. He was beautiful in the way that polished marble was beautiful, flawless, cold, and impossible to touch. His presence made the town smaller, as though it had been built only for him and found lacking. A sudden motion at the edge of the bakery caught her eye. A cart, overburdened with loaves of fresh bread, tilted slightly as the boy guiding it stumbled over a rut in the stone. A crusty round loaf bounced from the top and hit the ground with a muffled thud. It rolled once, stopped near a puddle, and lay still. No one seemed to notice. Elise's body tensed. She waited a beat. Another. No one moved toward the bread. The baker's assistant had already turned back toward the ovens. The crowd remained fixed on the count. Her pride fought with her hunger. But the longer she stared, the louder the sound in her ears, the rasp of her mother's breath, the emptiness pressing against her ribs. Her feet moved forward. She stepped toward the fallen loaf, each movement deliberate. She reached down. The sharp clatter of hooves startled her. One of the Count's horses had shifted slightly, bringing the man himself closer. Elise looked up. Lucien stood only a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her. Their eyes met, hers wide, startled, guarded. His unreadable. Up close, his features were even more severe. A narrow face, pale, with a sharp nose and well-formed mouth. His eyes were a cold, unusual green, watching her with what appeared to be curiosity, not concern, certainly not kindness. Her spine straightened, her fingers curling away from the bread. She rose slowly, breathing with effort. "I only ask," she said, voice barely above a whisper, but firm enough to carry, "if I may take the loaf that's already fallen." There was a pause, as if time had paused around them. Her heart pounded. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes now turned toward her, the silent tension behind every breath in the square. She didn't drop her gaze. Lucien's expression didn't change. His voice, when it came, was cool and low. "No." He turned without another word, the tails of his coat brushing past her. There was no shout, no noise of disapproval, only a brief ripple of silence. Then the crowd began to move again, shifting toward the steps of the bakery. Someone bumped the fallen loaf with a boot. Another horse passed too close, and the bread was crushed beneath the wheel of the carriage. Elise stood frozen for a moment longer. Her mouth was dry. Her arms felt oddly heavy at her sides. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked away. Her feet, bare and sore, found the edge of the stones where the moss grew thin. She didn't hurry. Her head remained low, not in shame, but in exhaustion. Her stomach clenched again, sharper this time, but she pushed the feeling down. A trickle of water ran beside the gutter, and her foot slipped briefly on the uneven edge. She caught herself. She didn't cry. Lucien moved toward the bakery entrance, flanked by two local officials. But something inside him tugged, something he couldn't quite name. He paused at the top step, then turned to glance back over his shoulder. She was still visible, a slim figure vanishing into the alley beyond the square, her arms empty, her back straight. It should have been nothing. She was no one. Still, something cold curled beneath his ribs. That night, unable to sleep, Lucien ordered a servant to inquire about the girl's name. But the man returned with no answers. She had vanished into the slums of the town and could not be found. The sun had not yet lifted fully over the horizon when Elise knelt beside the riverbank, the icy current biting at her wrists. The town of Val-sur-Loire still lingered in the stillness of early morning, its slate rooftops glistening with dew, its windows darkened by sleep. A thin fog hovered just above the ground, clinging to the river's edge and drifting between the rows of trees like breath on glass. Elise's skirt was soaked to the hem, and her fingers, red and cracked, gripped a bar of rough lye soap as she scrubbed at a blood-stained sleeve. The fabric, fine muslin, belonged to the mayor's wife. Too delicate for coarse soap, but Elise had no other choice. Around her, other washerwomen moved with practiced rhythm. They murmured to one another, voices low, some casting sideways glances at her but saying nothing. She had returned to her usual place at the water's edge, as if nothing had happened the day before, as if she hadn't stood in front of the Count and asked for fallen bread and been told no. The shame of it still burned beneath her skin. She had gone home empty-handed. Her mother, pale and fevered, had stirred briefly in the night and asked for broth. Elise had nothing to give, not even tea. She had knelt beside the straw mattress, wiping her mother's forehead with a damp cloth, whispering hollow reassurances that all would be well. By morning, the fever had worsened. Her mother's breaths came shallow and uneven. The apothecary had refused her again. No payment, no medicine. So Elise had returned to the river, because it was the only work that remained to her. She had 2 sous hidden in the hem of her shawl. Barely enough for bread, certainly not enough for laudanum or fever tinctures. The hunger from the day before had not abated. It pressed against her ribs like a hand inside her, hollow and insistent. But still she scrubbed. She worked in silence, the rhythm of her arms mechanical. The pain in her shoulders had settled into a steady throb, dull and manageable. She didn't look up when a washerwoman laughed too loudly nearby, or when another made a pointed comment about girls who forgot their place. Let them talk. She didn't have the energy to defend herself. Just before noon, she rinsed the final garment, wrung it dry, and laid it across the rocks to bleach under the pale sun. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or hunger she couldn't tell. She wrapped her shawl tightly around herself, fingers curling into the fabric, and made her way back to town. Near the tannery, she paused to examine a flyer tacked to the side of a post. It offered 3 sous for the delivery of mended lace to Madame de Breval, nothing more than a short errand, but enough to buy broth and perhaps a crust. Her hands were still damp, and the ink smudged beneath her thumb as she tore the paper from the post. Madame de Breval lived within the city walls, in the upper quarter. Elise had only been there once before, and only briefly. It was the side of Val-sur-Loire where the houses were not crumbling, and the windows held unbroken glass, where chimney smoke did not choke the streets. She returned to her attic room and retrieved the mended lace from a parcel wrapped in linen, kissed her mother's temple, and whispered that she would return soon. The walk to the upper quarter was uphill, the kind of slope that wore at the calves and lungs. By the time she reached the gates, her chest burned, and her breath came in shallow draws. She passed beneath the iron archway and into the neat, silent streets lined with stone facades and polished shutters. The noise of the market faded behind her, replaced by the occasional sound of a carriage wheel or the distant cry of a songbird. The Hôtel de Ville stood in a wide courtyard just before the Breval residence, its tall facade casting long shadows across the pale gravel. The mayor and his men were already gathered there, their hats tucked beneath their arms, voices low and formal. And standing among them, holding the reins of his stallion, was Count Lucien d'Arsac. Elise froze. He wore a coat the color of storm clouds, and his gloves were tucked neatly into one hand. His presence, as before, stilled the space around him. His horse shifted beside him, sleek and muscular, its tack glinting with polished brass. Lucien's posture was easy but alert, the stance of a man who never quite relaxed, even among allies. Her grip tightened on the parcel of lace. She lowered her head and tried to move quickly across the edge of the courtyard, her feet careful on the gravel. But fate, so often indifferent, seemed to lean toward cruelty today. A stable boy, carrying a wooden pail, tripped near the fountain. The bucket hit the stones with a crack, splashing cold water across the path. Lucien turned at the sound. His eyes found her instantly. Not her face, her. There was something in the recognition, a pause in his breath, a narrowing of his gaze. She kept walking, her steps clipped and quiet. Her hands trembled again, but this time from something she didn't name. She didn't look at him. Behind her, the sound of boots on gravel. He was dismounting. She could sense it without turning. The shift in energy. The way conversation stilled behind her, how one or two men looked past her shoulder with faint surprise. She didn't stop. She passed through the wrought iron gate of the Breval residence and gave her name to the porter with a voice that barely cracked. The door opened. She stepped inside. Lucien stood in the courtyard, motionless. He hadn't called to her, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved past the threshold, but he had followed. Inside the grand home, the walls were lined with tapestries and gilt-framed portraits. Light from a wide window spilled across the parquet floor, casting pale stripes across her path. A servant led her down the corridor and gestured toward a low bench in the servants' vestibule. She sat, parcel in her lap, the warmth of the interior only sharpening the contrast to the cold she had carried all morning. She waited. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that Madame de Breval had seen Lucien's momentary pursuit. From her salon window, the noble woman had watched the Count dismount, cross the courtyard, and pause. That was all. But it was more than enough. Aimée de Breval, her daughter, had been positioned carefully for months, guided by her mother's subtle machinations, her father's political interest. A match with Count d'Arsac would restore the Breval family's dwindling influence and secure Aimée a future of title and wealth. But Lucien had proven resistant, courteous, yes, obliging in public, but indifferent in every other way. Until now. Madame de Breval turned from the window, her expression tight with calculation. In the servants' corridor, Elise sat still, listening to the faint echoes of voices above. She didn't dare rise or speak. The parcel remained on her knees, the edge of the lace just visible between folds. The silence stretched. At last, the housemaid returned and accepted the delivery without comment. Elise stood, her knees stiff, and turned to leave. She passed the vestibule, entered the marble-tiled foyer, and reached the top step of the entrance hall, just as the afternoon light shifted behind the heavy curtains. She opened the door and stepped out, drawing her shawl close. And then she heard her name. Low, close, and wrong. It was not spoken as a greeting, but as an accusation. She turned slowly toward the voice and saw one of Madame de Breval's senior attendants, a man whose name she did not know, watching her from the shadows of the archway. His face was pinched with suspicion, his eyes hard and assessing. He stepped forward, and his voice sharpened. "You there. Stop. I believe you've taken something that does not belong to you." The moment Elise turned, the man's hand shot out and seized the basket from her grip. She gasped as the worn handle was yanked free, her fingers slipping against the wet fibers. The parcel of lace tumbled to the stone floor, one end unwrapping as it fell. The white edging splayed open like a wound. "Search it," the man barked to a footman nearby. The footman hesitated, glancing toward the inner hall, but then obeyed. His hands were rough, impatient, as he rifled through the thin linen. The lace was lifted and shaken, as if it might conceal a hidden coin or jewel. The lining of the basket was peeled back. A thin crust of dried bread fell out, one Elise had tucked away earlier, half-eaten and wrapped in old cloth. It landed on the floor with a pathetic thud. "I didn't take anything," she whispered. No one answered her. Another servant had appeared, and then another. Word spread fast through houses like these, where polished floors and painted ceilings disguised the tangled web of gossip underneath. A spoon, a silver spoon from the formal dining set, embossed with the Breval family crest, was missing, and Elise was the only outsider who had entered the house that morning. She tried again. "Please, I only delivered the lace." Her voice was quiet, frayed at the edges. It hardly mattered. The footman stepped back, hands empty. "There's nothing here," he muttered. But the damage had already begun. A chambermaid leaned into another's ear. A manservant frowned as he stared at her face, as though trying to remember where he'd seen her before. The look was not curiosity, but judgment. Not, "Who is she?" but, "Of course she would." The steward arrived next, summoned from the upper level with a sheaf of receipts, still in one hand. He was a tall, pale man, with a pinched mouth and the unmistakable confidence of someone used to managing other people's discomfort. He glanced at the overturned basket, the spilled lace, the stunned girl. "The spoon was here yesterday," he said aloud, more for the others than for her. "The Countess herself used it for her luncheon tray." "I never—" Elise started, then stopped. The steward didn't look at her. He turned to the man who'd first made the accusation. "Alert the mayor's office. We'll need a formal search before it's reported missing in writing." "But I don't have it," she said louder this time. "I never touched anything that wasn't mine." A few heads turned. Others looked away, embarrassed for her, or eager for more. The steward flicked his fingers toward the footman. "Take her to the back. Don't let her leave the premises until the guards arrive." One of the men grasped her arm. Not cruelly, but with the kind of authority that made her bones go cold. Her knees stiffened as she resisted. "I have to go home," she said quickly. "My mother." "No one leaves," the steward said without glancing up from his papers. "We'll have the report soon enough." They led her past the main staircase, through a narrow hallway to the back wing of the house, a part reserved for kitchens and sculleries, where the scent of yeast and broth drifted thick through the air. She was placed near the rear entrance, beside a row of baskets filled with onions, and told to wait. No one spoke to her. She stood in silence, one hand clenching the frayed edge of her shawl, the other pressed against her waist. Her heart pounded in slow, dull pulses, like the hammer of something coming undone inside her chest. The shame weighed heavier than her hunger had. Outside, clouds gathered low over the rooftops, casting pale shadows through the high windows. The town was still. Even the birds had quieted. In another part of the house, Count Lucien d'Arsac stood beside Madame de Breval in the receiving salon, listening with a look of polite detachment as she poured tea. She spoke of improvements to the municipal gardens, of the bridge stones being incorrectly measured, of the difficulties of managing a household with limited staff, and then, with the flick of a wrist, she mentioned the theft. "A rather unfortunate incident," she said lightly. "One of the washerwomen, or seamstresses, I can't quite recall which, apparently pocketed a silver spoon this morning. A girl sent to deliver lace. We've detained her for now." Lucien said nothing. "She was rather pale," Madame de Breval continued, "with an unremarkable face, though she carried herself like someone pretending not to be frightened. Her name— what was it?" She tapped her lip, then waved her hand. "Something common. Elise, I believe." Lucien's cup stopped mid-air. "Elise Marchand," she added. "I only remember because the laundress mentioned she'd seen her at the river, probably one of the river girls." The name struck like a pebble against glass. Lucien set the cup down, carefully. Too carefully. He rose without excuse, only a faint nod, and turned from the salon. The conversation behind him faltered. Madame de Breval blinked after him, confused, then annoyed. But she said nothing as he disappeared through the door. Outside, his stallion waited, still saddled. Lucien swung into the saddle and directed the horse around the far side of the house, ignoring the startled glances of the grooms. He took no companion, no steward. In the space of a few moments, he crossed the width of the garden paths and approached the side entrance to the servants' wing. He dismounted. His boots struck the flagstone with crisp, measured steps. A cook's assistant opened the door, recognized him, and bowed clumsily. Lucien stepped inside without pausing. In the corridor beyond, near the kitchen threshold, Elise stood motionless. Her back was to him at first, but she felt the shift in the air before she turned, the quiet that fell like the silence before a bell. She looked up. Lucien stopped. Her face was pale, her lips colorless. Her eyes held a desperate sort of clarity, as if something inside her had already broken and been stitched together again, badly. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her posture rigid with the effort of not collapsing. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The steward appeared at the end of the corridor, hurrying forward with a frown. "My lord," he said. "I wasn't told you'd returned. We're just about to—" Lucian raised a hand. The steward stopped. "I want the report," Lucian said quietly. "Now." A servant handed it over. A thin slip of parchment noting only the time of the incident, the missing item, and the girl's name. No signature. No proof. Lucien read it once, eyes scanning quickly. Then he looked at Elise again. She had not moved. She didn't plead. She didn't protest. She only watched him as if she already knew what the world thought of girls like her. He turned back to the steward. "There's no evidence," he said. His voice, though soft, was immovable. "You'll release her?" "My lord," the steward began. "We haven't conducted a full—" "You've detained an innocent girl without cause." His tone sharpened just slightly. "You'll release her. Now." The staff exchanged glances. The steward hesitated, then bowed. Lucien didn't look back. He didn't watch as Elise turned, slowly, and stepped out into the open air. She walked across the gravel path, the same way she had come, but slower this time, her shoulders heavy, her head low. She carried nothing, not the lace, not her basket, just silence. Lucien remained at the door. He didn't follow. But as the wind shifted and her figure faded into the streets beyond, he turned to his valet and spoke under his breath. "Follow her, and find out where she lives." The attic above the cooper's shop was little more than a slanted box beneath a leaking roof. The single window was warped from age, its glass clouded with grit, and the beams groaned whenever the wind shifted. Elise let herself in quietly, stepping over the worn threshold with slow, careful feet. Her body ached in places that had no name, her limbs heavy with fatigue, her throat dry from the effort of swallowing the day. The silence inside the room was broken only by her mother's breathing, a low, erratic sound, like wind pushing through dry reeds. The mattress was thin and uneven, pressed into the floorboards beneath two threadbare blankets. A damp cloth had slipped from her mother's brow. Elise knelt and replaced it with practiced hands, adjusting the covers to gather what little warmth there was. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Her mother didn't stir. The last of the coins, 2 copper sous wrapped in a twist of paper, were hidden beneath the loose floorboard by the door. Elise retrieved them and went back downstairs to the neighbor's room, where a pot of thin broth simmered over a blackened stove. The woman, a widow with 5 children, didn't ask questions when Elise held out her hand with the coins. She ladled the liquid into a chipped crock and handed it over wordlessly. Back in the attic, Elise fed her mother by the spoonful, coaxing her to sip between shivers. The broth barely had taste. Water, a bone, a few strands of celery. But it was warm, and her mother swallowed it slowly, drowsily. Once the bowl was empty, Elise placed it on the floor and covered her again, tucking the blanket beneath her shoulders. The light faded early through the grimy glass, the sky turning from pale gray to violet. She did not speak of what had happened at the Breval residence. Not of the accusation, nor the basket snatched from her hands, nor the way her name had been spoken like a stain. Not of the shame that clung to her like smoke. She said nothing of the Count appearing in the corridor, of the stillness in his voice, of the way everyone had obeyed him with a glance. Especially not that. It didn't make sense, and she couldn't make herself believe it had meant anything at all. Men like him didn't care about girls like her. He hadn't helped her for her sake. It had been a display, one of power, of control, of noble pride, bruised by the idea that someone in his circle had mishandled a situation. That was all. It had to be. She lay down on the floor beside the mattress, curled into her shawl for warmth, her body close enough to feel her mother's weak breath. Outside, the wind began to rise. It slipped through the gaps in the roof slats and carried the scent of wet earth into the room. Her bones ached from the cold. She didn't sleep deeply. When she opened her eyes again, it was dawn. A sliver of pale light fell across the floor from the cracked window. Her mother still slept, her breathing no better, no worse. Elise stretched her arms slowly, the joints in her shoulders stiff, then pushed herself upright. As she moved to the door, something caught her eye. There, resting on the narrow wooden stoop outside, was a parcel. She paused. It was wrapped in linen, knotted neatly with twine, the folds sharp and clean. Not like something hastily bundled, but like a package prepared with care. No name, no note. Just left there in the faint blue light of morning. Her heartbeat slowed as she reached for it. The parcel was light, but not empty. She carried it inside, closed the door with a quiet click, and untied the knot. Inside, she found a half loaf of fresh bread, 2 eggs wrapped in straw, and a small wedge of hard cheese. Not much, but enough for 2 people to eat and feel full. It wasn't charity bread from the church, dry and days old. This had come from someone's table. She stared at the food for a long moment, then folded the cloth back over it. Her stomach growled in protest, but she didn't eat right away. Instead, she warmed water from the neighbor's kettle and used it to wipe her mother's face, then gave her a few sips of broth from the night before. Later, when the room had warmed slightly and her mother dozed again, she sliced the bread and shared it between them. The cheese melted slowly on her tongue, sharp and comforting. Her hunger eased, but not the unease that sat heavy beneath her ribs. Who had left it? She asked the widow downstairs, but the woman only shook her head. No one came by. Not that I saw. That evening, it happened again. A knock, barely more than a tap. A pause. Then silence. By the time she opened the door, the stairs were empty. Only another parcel waited on the stoop, bundled tightly in linen. This time it held more food. Carrots, dried beans, another piece of bread, and something else. A bundle of folded cloth. Clean linen, white and fresh, the kind used for sickbeds or wrapping wounds. Elise stood holding it in both hands, unsure what to do. She looked out at the darkening street, but saw nothing. No one. Just a stray cat darting beneath a cart and the yellow glow of a lantern in a window across the way. She brought the parcel inside and laid the cloth beside her mother's mattress. Still, no note, no explanation. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't dare feel comforted. Gifts had expectations. She'd grown up watching neighbors learn that lesson the hard way. There was always a price, but the parcel had come without words, and no one had followed. No shadow lingered at the foot of the stairs. If someone wanted to use her, surely they would not begin with clean linen and vegetables. She stood at the door long after the sun had gone down, her hand on the latch, her gaze fixed on the quiet street beyond. Across the way, unseen by her, Lucien stood beneath the awning of an old carriage house, cloaked in the shadows. He had not intended to come. He had told his valet to deliver the parcel and report back. But when the man had returned with the address and description of the attic room, Lucien had found himself rising from his chair and walking out of the study without explanation. He had stopped only when he reached the corner near the cooper's shop. He remained there now, unmoving, as he watched the flicker of candlelight in the attic window and the slim figure that emerged onto the small balcony. Elise shook out a blanket, her arms stretched wide as the fabric caught the wind. Her hair was pinned in a haphazard coil, wisps escaping at the nape of her neck. She held the blanket with the calm precision of someone used to doing everything alone. Lucien felt something shift low in his chest, a tightness or pressure. He didn't name it. He turned sharply and walked away, each step measured, as if distance could dissolve what he had just seen. That night, as the fire in the great hearth of Chateau d'Arsac burned low, the household staff heard the sound of wheels on gravel. A carriage arrived unannounced. From it stepped the Comtesse d'Arsac, draped in sable-trimmed velvet, her face composed with imperial stillness, and her eyes sharp with purpose. She did not remove her gloves as she entered the hall. "Where," she asked the butler coldly, "is my nephew, and why is he interfering in the affairs of a washerwoman?" The Comtesse d'Arsac did not waste time with pleasantries. She stepped into the chateau's front hall with the restrained grace of someone who had long ruled rooms larger than this one, and men more ambitious than her nephew. Her traveling cloak fell across her shoulders in stiff folds of deep grey velvet, edged in sable, and her gloved hands barely moved as the butler helped her remove it. She wore no jewels except a single brooch pinned at the throat, a heavy garnet set in black enamel. Her presence filled the space like a chill. Lucien was in the study, seated near the hearth with a ledger open in front of him, and a glass of brandy untouched beside his chair. He didn't rise when she entered, though the flicker of recognition in his eyes was unmistakable. "Aunt," he said calmly. She studied him for a long moment before answering. "I should have known," she murmured, walking slowly toward the fire. "You've always had a way of drawing attention at precisely the wrong moment. I'd hoped that age might dull your taste for scandal." Lucien said nothing. The Comtesse sat, arranging her skirts with meticulous care. "I hear you've been wandering the streets of Val-sur-Loire on foot," she said lightly, "and giving orders in kitchens, orders concerning washerwomen." He tilted his head slightly, his face unreadable. "You've been speaking with Madame de Breval." "Among others," she said, though she was the most eager to confide. There was a pause. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside the windows, clouds dragged their bellies low over the vineyards, heavy with the promise of rain. "She's concerned, of course," the Comtesse continued. "Not for you, but for her daughter. Aimée has been under the illusion that your alliance is a matter of time. I've never discouraged the belief." Lucien exhaled slowly. "You negotiated it." The Comtesse lifted one brow. "We discussed possibilities. Quietly, respectfully. Your name still carries weight, Lucien, despite your efforts to lessen it." He looked back at the fire. "I haven't lessened it." "No," she said softly. "But you are beginning to make people wonder." The words hung between them. Lucien remained still, his eyes reflecting the flames but giving away little else. His posture was relaxed, but there was a tension in the line of his shoulders, the kind that came from hours of holding something back. The Comtesse studied him more closely now. Her expression didn't change, but the coolness in her voice deepened. "I won't insult you by asking if the rumors are true. You wouldn't deny them, and I have no interest in chasing whispers, but I will ask you this plainly. Is your attention fixed on a girl without name, without dowry, without consequence?" Lucien turned his head toward her, his voice even. "She was wrongly accused." "Perhaps," she said, "but that isn't the question." He said nothing. "You know what's at stake. The Restoration has given us little more than a borrowed crown and a borrowed peace. Old families are scrambling to reclaim their places, and ours is not exempt. If you begin to show favoritism toward a common girl, publicly, visibly, you risk more than your reputation. You risk ours." Still he didn't speak. The Comtesse's voice dropped, quieter than before. "It's one thing to bend, Lucien. The world expects a little softness now and then. But break? Over her? For what?" He stood then, slowly. He crossed to the sideboard, poured a fresh measure of brandy into his glass, and stared down into it. "I didn't break," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you didn't look away either." Lucien lifted the glass, drank once, then set it down untouched again. "She's not your concern," the Comtesse said firmly. "If you owe her a kindness, then consider it repaid. But there will be no future for you in that direction. I won't allow it." He glanced back at her, one corner of his mouth lifting, not in humor, but in resignation. "I didn't ask your permission." She rose then, her movements controlled, her tone cooling even further. "Then consider this a warning. Let the moment pass. Let her fade. Nobility may bend, but it does not break for sentiment, especially not for someone the world won't remember." She left him standing in the study, the firelight casting long shadows behind him. That afternoon, as promised, the Comtesse made her way to the Breval residence, her carriage moving slowly through the polished streets of the upper quarter. She arrived with a cordial note in hand and a smile carefully shaped for diplomacy. Madame de Breval welcomed her with veiled delight, eager to restore the social equilibrium upset by Lucien's unusual behavior. The two women spoke for the better part of an hour, discussing gardens, music, and parish charities. Only once did the conversation drift toward the laced delivery girl and the misunderstanding that had so inconveniently arisen. The Comtesse, with perfect composure, advised that it would be best if the girl were not engaged again. Quietly, without fanfare, just kept away. Madame de Breval agreed at once. By the next morning the effect was clear. Elise walked to the milliner's shop and was turned away. Then to the herbalist's house, where the wife shook her head apologetically and said the old cloths had already been mended. The dressmaker, who usually gave her scraps for washing, told her there was nothing in need of work this week, nor next. No one explained, no one accused. Doors simply didn't open. By the time she returned to the attic that evening, the truth pressed tight against her chest like a stone. Her mother asked what was wrong. Elise only smiled faintly and said she was tired. But tired didn't explain the fear creeping into her bones. She had nothing left to sell. Her mother's fever still came and went. The parcels had stopped. There was no work, only silence. The next morning, driven by something more desperate than pride, she walked back toward the Breval residence. The clouds above were low and heavy, and the wind tugged at her skirt as she made her way along the edge of the Hôtel de Ville courtyard. Her shoes, thin, borrowed, and too small, bit into the sides of her feet. Her shawl kept slipping from her shoulders. Still, she walked, head high. She passed through the wrought iron gates, her breath tight with dread. The servant at the door hesitated, his mouth already forming a refusal. "I only want to ask for work," she said quietly. "Anything." Before the man could answer, footsteps echoed across the marble floor behind him. Lucien Darsac stepped into view. He had come that day for an entirely different reason. Something routine, a conversation with Madame de Breval regarding land assessments. But the moment his gaze lifted and found her standing there in the doorway, something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, not regret, recognition, and something deeper. Elise froze. They looked at one another, neither prepared. She opened her mouth to speak, or to leave, she didn't know which, only to move, to end the unbearable stillness. But before she could turn, Lucien said her name, softly, clearly, and with a certainty that stopped her in her tracks. The syllables of her name spoken in that voice, low, measured, unmistakable, stopped her as if she had been struck. Elise froze beneath the threshold of the Breval residence, her hand still on the shawl that had begun to slip from her shoulder. The servant behind her drew back slightly, uncertain now. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour, its chime delicate and far away. Lucien was already walking toward her, his steps unhurried but purposeful. His coat was dark, the collar turned up slightly, his gloved hand resting lightly on the silver pommel of his walking stick, though he didn't seem to need its support. His expression was unreadable, not cold, but held behind a deliberate veil of composure. He paused only when he reached her side. "I believe this conversation is long overdue," he said quietly. His tone was not public, not meant for the servants or the open vestibule where anyone might hear. It was private, unyielding in its civility. The few onlookers scattered nearby seemed to sense that they were witnessing something they did not understand, and withdrew without being asked. Lucien didn't wait for her to speak. He gestured toward the hallway with a faint incline of his head. "Come," he said. "We'll talk where no one is watching." Elise hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of her shawl. The humiliation of being seen here, standing as a petitioner and not a guest, was raw against her skin. But the weight of his gaze, and the unspoken promise of privacy, left her little choice. She followed him through the vestibule and down the hall, each step deliberate, as if she could slow her own dread by stretching the seconds. He opened a door at the end of the corridor, revealing a small drawing room lined with dark wood and faded velvet. The curtains were half drawn, allowing only a muted gray light to enter. The hearth was cold, the air tinged with the sharp scent of dried lavender and old smoke. Once inside, he closed the door behind them. She stood near the wall, her back straight, hands folded tightly before her. He walked a short distance away and turned to face her, his expression still guarded, but his voice gentler than it had been in any of their previous exchanges. "I'm not here to revisit what happened before," he said. "I won't insult you with apologies that change nothing." She said nothing. Her silence was taut, like fabric pulled too tightly over a frame. "But I can offer you something now," he continued. "Not out of guilt, and not out of pity." Her throat closed slightly. She swallowed and looked down at the frayed edge of her sleeve. "My aunt," he said, "has need of a companion. Her eyesight is failing. She requires someone to read to her, assist with correspondence, walk with her in the gardens. It's a respectable position. The pay is fair. It includes room, board, and privacy." Elise lifted her eyes slowly. "I want to offer you the post." The air seemed to shift between them. She stared at him for a long moment, not trusting her ears. This was more than kindness. It was intrusion. Not violent or immediate, but precise. It placed her inside his house, beneath his protection, within reach of scrutiny. "I understand what it will look like," he said. "I understand what people will say, but this will be official. You will be employed, not kept. You will have a title and duties and autonomy." She felt heat rise slowly to her cheeks. "And I won't interfere beyond what's necessary," he added, his voice low. "Unless you wish otherwise." Her pulse fluttered painfully. Her mind leapt to her mother, fevered, growing weaker by the day, to the empty cupboard, the drying commissions, the way each door in the village had quietly closed in her face. This offer, no matter its origins, might be the only path left to survival. But still, her pride rebelled. Her chin lifted slightly. "Why me?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was as quiet as hers. "Because I trust you with her." That answer, so simple and so dangerous, left her with nothing to say. She accepted. Not because she believed it safe, but because it was the only option that gave her time, dignity, and the smallest measure of control. The following morning, she climbed the winding road to Château d'Arsac, with her belongings wrapped in one bundle and a letter of introduction in her hand. The path was still muddy from last night's rain. The countryside spread below her in washed-out green and pale gold. The vineyards grooved into the hills like the pleats of an enormous skirt. The chateau loomed at the crest, its walls pale limestone streaked with age, the windows tall and narrow, reflective. A maid opened the door and took her name. Minutes later, the Comtesse d'Arsac entered the receiving parlor, her spine straight despite the cane she carried. Her face was a fine sculpture of aristocratic bone and narrowed eyes. She examined Elise as one might inspect a tapestry for hidden flaws. "You're punctual," she said. "That's a better start than most." Her tone was polite, but cool. The disapproval beneath it wasn't masked, only restrained. The Comtesse did not offer tea or ask questions. Instead, she called for the housekeeper, gave a short list of expectations, and directed Elise to a room beneath the eaves, next to the linen attic. The space was clean but spare, a narrow bed, a writing table, and a window that looked east over the vineyards. A small chair sat beneath the sloped ceiling. Her trunk fit neatly beneath the bed. That afternoon, her duties began. She was shown how to prepare the reading materials, where the Comtesse's letters were filed, and how to steep the special herbal infusion the older woman sipped twice each day. There were no unnecessary conversations. The Comtesse did not seek familiarity, but she also did not belittle or patronize. Her displeasure was expressed with silence rather than insult. Lucienne did not appear. Over the days that followed, Elise adjusted to the rhythm of the house. She rose before sunrise, assisted the cook with light tasks, and then waited in the morning salon for the Comtesse's instructions. Each day included an hour of reading, then another of dictation. Sometimes they walked together in the walled garden, the Comtesse's hand resting lightly on Elise's arm. Lucien kept to his study, or rode alone through the hills, never joining them. Yet his presence lingered. She heard him in the hallways, glimpsed him across the courtyard, sensed him in the hush that followed when his footsteps faded from the corridor. He never sought her out. But the current between them was unmistakable. Every time she passed him in the corridor, something within her seemed to catch and hold. She began to see the outlines of his life more clearly. The stacks of letters on his desk, the names whispered by visitors, the tense meetings that ended in silence. It was a world ruled by obligation, precision, and old expectations, where affection had no place and the past never stopped following. She began to understand that the man who once refused her bread had been shaped by a structure that didn't bend easily, that his silence was not apathy, but control. One evening, as the Comtesse reclined in her armchair by the fire, Elise read from a memoir of the Duc de Berry's court. Her voice was steady, her eyes following the text. The room was quiet, the air warm with lamplight and cedar smoke. Then, without warning, the page slipped from her hand. It drifted to the floor and settled near her feet. She knelt to retrieve it, her fingers brushing the edge just as the door opened. Lucien stepped into the room. She froze, half bent, half turned. He looked at her, and something in his expression changed. It was not surprise nor guilt. It was softness, a loosening of that careful mask. The Comtesse, seated nearby, caught the shift. She said nothing in that moment. But later that night, as the fire died in her private chamber and the house fell into stillness, she summoned Lucien and waited for him in silence. When he entered, she looked at him with eyes colder than the marble busts in the hall. "Tell me," she said, "do you intend to court the girl or disgrace her?" In the days following the Comtesse's private confrontation with Lucien, the chateau settled into a curious stillness. No decisions were announced, no changes made. But a quiet shift had taken place, in glances, in posture, in the long silences passed across the drawing room, like a drawn breath never fully released. Then, one morning, as the mist still curled along the edge of the vineyards, the Comtesse summoned Elise to her sitting room and delivered the news with her usual composure. "We will attend the spring ball at Saint-Aignan next week," she said. "You will accompany me." The words were spoken without invitation, without explanation. But the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. If Elise was to remain, she would do so not in the shadows, but under the full glare of scrutiny. The ball, attended by every influential family in the region, would be her trial by fire. Acceptance or rejection would not come by whispered judgment alone, but by the eyes that watched her walk into that ballroom. The Comtesse said nothing further. She did not ask whether Elise had anything to wear. The following day, without being told, a seamstress known to the Comtesse's housekeeper arrived with a parcel, a gown of soft pearl gray silk, slightly out of fashion but well made, fitted to a slender figure. The sleeves were long, the neckline modest, the hem gently flared with a scalloped edge of lace. It had been worn before, likely by the daughter of a lesser noble, but the fabric was clean, and the bodice lined with fresh muslin. Along with it came slippers and gloves, both simple and without embellishment. On the night of the ball, the sky above Saint-Aignan glowed with lantern light, and the scent of lilacs drifted through the arched windows of the estate like perfume. Inside, the grand ballroom shimmered with candlelight. Mirrors climbed the walls, their gilt frames catching every flicker of flame. Music drifted from the musicians' gallery, waltzes, minuets, the hushed anticipation of dancers waiting to be seen. Elise entered on the Comtesse's arm. Her hair swept into a smooth twist at the nape of her neck, her gloves pristine. Her chin lifted, with the quiet strength of someone who had spent years learning how to survive being looked at without invitation. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She only moved forward, one step at a time, beside a woman who neither embraced her nor protected her, only presented her. The effect was immediate. Voices lowered, fans lifted. Glances passed between clusters of nobles like signals exchanged in a game. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why did she walk beside the Comtesse with no title, no chaperone, no claim? Lucien, already present and standing near the edge of the ballroom, turned as she entered. His eyes found her instantly. He didn't approach. Not yet. He nodded once to the Comtesse and remained still, his face unreadable, his posture deceptively relaxed. But the sharpness of his gaze told another story. Elise could feel it following her. She kept to the edge of the room at first, standing near the flower arrangements that spilled over the tops of polished tables. She watched the dancers, the way they moved like clockwork across the parquet, the way laughter rose in careful bursts, never too loud, never too sincere. She was not invisible. Far from it. Within minutes, a minor baron with a florid complexion approached, offering thin compliments and asking in a voice too loud whether she was from Paris, always Paris, as if any beauty without a pedigree must have been shaped by sin or scandal. She answered politely, giving nothing, offering less. Another man asked if she was related to the Darsac. A cousin, perhaps. A poor relation? Then Charles de Breval found her. Younger than his sister Aimée, but far less restrained, Charles was handsome in the careless way of men born with money and very little expected of them. His dark hair curled slightly at the temples, and his lips always looked as if they were hiding something they found amusing. "Your dress is charming," he said, holding a glass of champagne with one hand and blocking her view of the dance floor with the other. "Is it borrowed?" She met his eyes without flinching. He leaned closer. "They say you're the Count's little experiment, that he's taken a liking to sad-eyed girls who speak with pretty diction. Is that what they teach in the servant halls now?" Her breath caught just for a moment. She didn't answer. Lucien crossed the room like a storm moving beneath the surface of the sky. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He reached them in seconds and didn't greet Charles, didn't even look at him. His hand extended toward Elise. "Dance with me." It was not a question. Charles stepped aside with a barely concealed smirk. Elise hesitated only briefly. Then she placed her gloved hand in Lucien's and allowed him to lead her to the center of the floor. The music shifted into a slow waltz. As they turned beneath the chandelier, their eyes locked, not in challenge, not in defense, but in something deeper, something that trembled beneath the surface of restraint. He held her with the practiced formality of a nobleman, but every movement betrayed the tension between them, the awareness of skin through fabric, of breath shared, of words never spoken. She could barely breathe. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Around them, the entire room had quieted. Even the orchestra played more softly, as if aware that something delicate was unfolding and must not be disturbed. When the dance ended, Lucien released her hand gently and stepped back. His expression was the same as it had been when she first arrived, composed, unreadable. But in his eyes was a fire that hadn't been there before. And watching from the edge of the room, Aimée de Breval lowered her fan with slow deliberation. She crossed to the Comtesse, who stood beside a pair of seated dowagers sipping wine. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful, just loud enough to be heard by those who mattered. "It's astonishing, isn't it?" she murmured. "They say the girl was once kept by a lawyer in Paris. Or was it a banker? She had a different name then, of course. No one ever uses their real name when they live that kind of life." The Comtesse turned her head slowly. She didn't answer. But the damage was done. The lie passed from fan to ear, from whisper to shoulder. By the final waltz, half the ballroom had heard it. Lucien hadn't danced again. Elise had stood quietly near a marble column, pretending not to feel the eyes following her. The truth didn't matter. The rumor had been loosed, and nothing traveled faster among the nobility than a scandal whispered with feigned sympathy. Lucien found out before the last note faded. He didn't ask whether it was true. He didn't question who had said it. He only left, without a word, without seeking Elise, without offering her his arm, as the guests began to withdraw toward their carriages. She waited, first near the vestibule, then beside the mirrored corridor. But he never came. She returned to the chateau in silence, seated across from the Comtesse in the carriage, her gloved hands clenched in her lap. The sky above them was ink black, cloudless, uncaring. When Elise entered her room, the candles had already been lit. A letter lay folded on her dressing table. The seal was plain. Lucien's signature marked the bottom of the page. The words above it told her to leave the chateau at once. She didn't cry. Not when she read the letter, its script precise and careful, betraying nothing but the restraint that had always lived in his hands. Not when her eyes moved over the single line that told her to leave the chateau by first light. There was no explanation, no apology. Just the seal at the bottom and the weight of a door quietly closing. She folded the page, set it on the edge of the dressing table, and reached for the borrowed gown laid neatly across the back of the chair. The silence in the attic chamber pressed in around her as she began to pack. Her movements were quiet, methodical. The grey dress was folded and returned to its wrapping. The gloves were laid gently atop it, and the slippers placed in a separate cloth bag. The hair combs were removed from the drawer and left on the table, their enamel edges still warm from the candlelight. A scarf she had once found in her room, left anonymously, was set aside as well. Each piece that wasn't hers, each item given without words, she returned. By the time the sky turned the color of ash, her bundle was tied. She slipped from the room before the servants stirred, her shoes muffled against the rug that ran along the corridor. The great staircase creaked once as she passed, though no one descended to see her go. At the front door, she hesitated, not to look back, but to breathe. The scent of the chateau, clean stone and lemon oil, pressed into her memory like an imprint she couldn't shake. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the pre-dawn dark. Mist clung to the ground like a shawl drawn across the hills. The road was slick with last night's rain, mud seeping into her shoes with each step. Her bundle weighed more than it should have. Her arms ached by the time the gates of the estate disappeared behind her. She didn't look up to see if he was watching. By the time the first rooftops of Val-sur-Loire came into view, the sun had begun to rise, spilling a pale, colorless light over the tiled chimneys and the broken slates of the poorer quarter. Smoke had already begun to curl from some of the chimneys, grey and slow. Dogs barked somewhere near the tannery. The town stirred with the sullen heaviness of another day. Her return stirred more than morning noise. A few heads turned as she passed the bakery. A boy paused while tying a bundle of firewood. A woman washing the steps outside her door stopped scrubbing and stared. Their gazes were not warm, not welcoming, not cruel exactly, but curious in a way that cut deep. She reached the cooper's shop and climbed the narrow stairs. Inside, the attic room had changed little. Her mother lay just as she had left her, only weaker now, her breath a shallow flutter, her skin warmer than before, damp with fever. The bowl at her bedside was dry. The cloth needed washing. The air smelled of sickness and boiled water gone cold. Elise removed her shawl and went to work without a word. Downstairs, the neighbor blinked in surprise when she knocked and asked for broth. "We weren't sure you'd come back," the woman said cautiously. "Some thought you'd left for good." "There's been talk." Elise took the bowl without answering. The coins she left on the table were the last of what she had. Her mother swallowed a few spoonfuls before sleep took her again. That afternoon, Elise returned to the riverbank. The water was colder than before, fed by snowmelt and spring rains. Her fingers went numb almost immediately, her sleeves darkened with the splash of soap and fabric. The other washerwomen glanced up as she arrived. Some said nothing, a few muttered under their breath. She scrubbed harder. The castle, the ball, the scent of burning beeswax and the brush of a satin hem across polished floors. She tried to push it all away, but it clung to her. It clung to her skin the way cold clung to stone, impossible to shake and slow to leave. Forgetting wasn't simple. At the market, she was no longer offered work. One house turned her away, then another. At the last, the maid told her the lady was not receiving anyone of her background at present. The final blow came at the apothecary. He had once been kind, if curt, and allowed her credit for tinctures and herbs. Now he shook his head. "Not without payment," he said. "It's not personal. The Brevals have warned us about troublemakers. I can't afford to cross them." She left without protest. Lucienne remained in the chateau, but its corridors had grown heavier in her absence. The Comtesse had returned to Paris. The staff walked more quietly. Even the horses moved restlessly in the stables, as if sensing a change. Lucien told himself it had been necessary, that the rumors had grown too loud, that the ball had made things worse, that removing her was a way to spare her, before she was too deeply pulled into a life she didn't deserve and one he had no right to offer. But the silence pressed against him like water filling a sealed room. The sight of her in that ballroom, the calm dignity, the stillness of her gaze, refused to leave him. At night, he walked the corridors. He returned to the study and sat at the same desk, with the same letters before him. But the ink seemed faded, the words hollow. He read and reread the same reports without remembering a single line. By the 5th day, he no longer knew whether his silence was a punishment for her or for himself. That evening, Elise stepped into the attic and found her mother still as stone, her face damp, her fingers curled too tightly. The fever had worsened. Her skin burned to the touch, her breaths ragged and irregular. There was no money, no help. She ran. Down the stairs, through the alleys slick with water, across the square where the bakery's fire still glowed faintly behind drawn shutters. Her skirt caught on a broken crate. She stumbled, righted herself, kept running. Up the hill. The road curved, narrow and slick with mud. Her lungs burned. Her bundle had long since fallen from her shoulder, discarded. She reached the gates of the chateau gasping, her voice catching in her throat. She shouted once, then again. The guard stepped forward, uncertain. She grabbed the bars. "Please," she called. "Please, it's my mother. I need help. She's dying." The man frowned, glancing toward the windows. "No one is to be let in without the Count's instruction. Please." Her voice cracked. She pressed both hands against the gate. Her body trembled with effort, with cold, with something that felt like breaking. Behind the glass of an upstairs window, Lucien stood. He heard her, and did nothing. Lucien did not sleep. By the time dawn bled through the curtains and cast a faint gold sheen across the walls of the study, he was still standing at the window, unmoving. Her voice, hoarse and panicked, broken by the iron bars of the gate, echoed like a struck bell through his skull. It had not faded with the hours. It clung to him, wrapped tight around every breath, every pulse. He had heard her. He had done nothing. The fire in the grate had long since collapsed to ash. Cold had settled into the seams of the room, and still he hadn't moved. He had told himself it was necessary, that letting her back into his world would destroy the small dignity she had left, that keeping her out was a kindness, a barrier against the cruelty of a world eager to devour anything soft. But her cry had not been soft. It had carried every injury he had given her. By the time he mounted his horse, the town below was only just beginning to stir. Smoke rose sluggishly from chimneys, roosters calling from behind crooked shutters. The road was still wet from night rain. He wore no riding coat, no gloves. He rode without escort or announcement. At the edge of Val-sur-Loire, he dismounted and tied the reins to a hitching post near the cooper's shop. The stairs to the attic were narrow and warped, their boards worn by years of uneven feet. When he reached the top, he hesitated once, long enough to feel the weight of what waited behind the door, then raised his hand and knocked. There was no answer. He opened it. Inside, the room was dim, smelling of vinegar, damp linen, and something more raw. Fever. Elise sat beside the mattress on the floor, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her fingers stained with broth and sweat. Her face was pale, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, strands sticking to her cheek. Her eyes widened when she saw him, but she did not rise. Lucian stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I brought medicine," he said. She stared at him. He knelt beside the mattress and pulled a small parcel from his coat. It held a vial and a folded note, both bearing the seal of the family physician. Without waiting for her response, he uncorked the vial and poured a few drops into a spoon, then looked to her for permission. She gave it with a nod, silent, guarded. He passed her the spoon. She coaxed it between her mother's lips. The liquid trembled slightly before it was swallowed. They said nothing for a long time. Lucien remained kneeling, his hands resting on his thighs. The lines beneath his eyes were sharper than she'd ever seen them. His coat was damp at the hem. His boots bore the faint outline of mud. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "I know. You left me a letter. I know that too." Still, he made no excuses. She pressed a cool cloth to her mother's brow, blinking slowly. "She's not past saving," he said quietly. "The fever's deep, but the physician thinks she'll hold through the next day, if the tonic does its work." "She would have died," Elise said, "if you hadn't come." He shook his head once, hard. "She wouldn't have needed saving at all if I hadn't—" He stopped himself, the words unfinished. She turned away, wringing out the cloth with trembling hands. He didn't speak again. He didn't rise. He stayed until the candle beside the bed burned low and the room filled with the deep, rhythmic breaths of someone beginning to sleep without pain. Then he stood and left, without asking for thanks. The next day, he returned. So did the day after that. Not with fanfare, not with apology, but with medicine, broth, fresh sheets, and news from the physician. He walked through the village streets without shame, ignoring the curious glances, the whispers that followed his footsteps like smoke. He no longer shielded himself from the talk. He let it come, let it burn. He brought firewood one morning, a book of poetry the next. He never stayed long, but he came. And Elise, slowly, let him stay longer. At first she answered him in clipped words, practical and necessary. Then the silences between them grew shorter, less brittle. She asked about the Comtesse, about the vineyard. He answered with quiet honesty. When she finally asked him why he had sent her away, he looked at her for a long time before answering. "I thought it would spare you what the world would say." "And did it?" "No." He never spoke of love. He didn't say the word. But everything in his voice, in his steadiness, in the way he handed her the spoon each morning without needing to be asked, all of it said what he didn't. He had stopped hiding. She didn't forgive him all at once, but she began to trust that he wasn't trying to be forgiven. He only stayed. By the second week, her mother's fever had broken. The color returned to her cheeks, faint but certain. Her eyes stayed open longer each day. She spoke Elise's name with clearer breath. On the third Sunday, she sat up to eat a bowl of porridge without assistance. Lucien wasn't there that day. He had returned to the chateau, briefly, quietly. The Comtesse d'Arsac had arrived from Paris, summoned by a series of letters that grew more direct with each passing week. She found her nephew seated in the library, unmoved by her displeasure. "You're risking everything," she told him. He didn't disagree. She paced, her cane tapping sharply against the stone. "If you persist, the Brevals will sever ties entirely. They already have. And your name, our name, will lose its standing." He met her gaze without flinching. "It already did." She paused at that. The silence between them stretched. Then she sat. "Do what you will," she said at last, "but do not expect me to repair what breaks." He nodded once, and the Comtesse said no more. Madame de Breval, when she learned of Lucien's continued visits to the attic above the cooper's shop, shifted her attention swiftly to a viscount's son with more titles than sense. The gossip quieted not from resolution, but from distraction. As spring deepened, Val-sur-Loire blossomed into soft greens and blush pinks. The trees unfurled new leaves. The air warmed. Children returned to the square in the afternoons, their laughter echoing through the alleyways. Elise received a letter from the wife of the town merchant, asking whether she might consider teaching her daughters to read and sew. The offer came not as charity, but as respect, from one woman to another. She accepted, but on her own terms. She set her hours, prepared lessons, and insisted on bringing her own supplies. The merchant's daughters, two quiet-eyed girls with nervous fingers, adored her within days. Lucien stopped visiting daily, but he wrote. One letter each morning, sometimes only a few lines. A note about the vineyard. A memory from the garden. A description of a book he'd read. He never demanded answers, never asked for promises. He simply waited. And Elise, reading each page in the quiet hours before work, let the words settle deeper than she intended. One afternoon, as she stepped from the tailor's shop with a scrap of fabric for her pupils to practice stitching, she turned the corner and paused at the sight ahead. Lucien stood near the well, speaking to an old man selling baskets. His coat was dusted with pollen. A letter was folded beneath his arm. He hadn't seen her yet, but she didn't look away. The orchard lay just beyond the edge of Val-sur-Loire, where the river bent gently and the air smelled faintly of apple blossoms and warming earth. It was early still, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the thin mist that clung to the grass. Birds called from hidden branches, and bees moved lazily between wildflowers, stirred from their nests by the steady return of spring. Lucien saw her before she saw him. She was sitting beneath one of the flowering trees, its low branches heavy with pale blossoms that trembled in the breeze. A book rested open across her knees, one hand lightly holding the page as her gaze moved steadily across the text. Her shoes had been set aside in the grass, and the hem of her dress, soft and worn, not rich, not borrowed, but entirely her own, brushed the green blades as she shifted slightly for comfort. He didn't call to her. He didn't interrupt. He stood at a distance for a long moment watching, not as a man watching a woman, but as someone seeing peace in its most unassuming form, fragile, unguarded, and hard-earned. When she lifted her head, she didn't startle. Her eyes met his calmly, as though she'd known he would come. "You found me," she said, her voice low. "I was walking," he replied. "I hoped." She closed the book gently and laid it beside her. Lucien took a step forward, then another. Still, she didn't move. "I thought you were avoiding me," she said. "I wasn't," he answered. "Not anymore." A pause stretched between them. Not heavy, not uncertain. Just quiet. She nodded toward the patch of grass beside her. "You may sit, if you like." He did. Slowly. Not with the self-assured elegance of a nobleman, but with the restraint of someone deeply aware of his own fallibility. His knees creaked faintly in the soft earth as he settled beside her. They sat side by side, backs to the tree, not touching. She glanced at him. "Why did you come to the bakery that day?" It was not accusation in her voice, only curiosity, softened by time. He looked down at the grass. "I came for business. The steward wanted to meet with the miller. There was a matter about grain supplies for the estate. I wasn't meant to stay long." "But you did." He gave a faint nod. "And you left different," she said. His mouth curved. "Yes." She turned her gaze out toward the orchard. It was a hard crust of bread, nothing more. Lucien looked at her then, and something in his face softened in a way that had nothing to do with light or shadow. "To you, maybe," he said, "but not to me." She smiled, not wide, but with quietness and a shade of memory. You said no. I did. She reached for a petal that had drifted down onto her skirt and brushed it away. And yet, somehow, you still found your way here, she said gently. He exhaled. I didn't expect to be changed by it, or by you. The words were simple, no embellishment, no grandness. But in them lived a kind of reverence, shaped by weeks of silence and guilt, of watching her strength and knowing the ruin he had nearly made of it. He shifted slightly, and his palm flattened against the grass between them. I can't undo what I did, he said, or how late I came to understand it. She didn't reply at once. Then, very slowly, she reached over and placed her hand atop his. Her fingers were small, strong, worn by work. Her touch was not tentative but steady, like her gaze. I never wanted grand apologies, she said. Only truth. Lucian turned his palm to curl around hers, not tightly, not possessively, but with a kind of solemn promise. He didn't speak more. He only sat there beside her, in the filtered light beneath the tree, letting the silence grow warm. After a moment, she shifted closer. With a quiet sigh, she leaned against his shoulder, her temple resting lightly against the fabric of his coat. Her hair brushed his jaw, and her breath moved in rhythm with his. There was no triumph in the moment, no thunderous declaration or sweeping gesture, only a shared quiet. A life not promised, but chosen, breath by breath, glance by glance, fault by fault. The blossoms above them swayed. A bee hummed past. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang out the hour. Neither moved. When the sun had fully risen and the shadows had grown shorter, they rose together. No words passed between them as they walked the path back into town, their steps in rhythm. Her hand remained tucked in the crook of his elbow, not as a prize, not as possession, but as presence. The village was beginning to stir in earnest now. Market carts rolled slowly into the square. A dog barked near the fountain. The air smelled of bread and stone and morning. They reached the bakery. It hadn't changed. The same shutters, the same warm scent of rising dough. A boy hauling a cart of loaves passed too quickly near the curb, and one fell, a single round loaf that struck the cobblestones and rolled to a stop. Lucien stooped and picked it up. He brushed the dust from the crust and turned, not to keep it, not to pocket it, but to hand it to a child standing nearby, barefoot and wide-eyed. The boy took it without a word and ran. Lucien stood for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked back at Elise. She stood still, the light catching in her eyes. It wasn't joy that shone there, nor sorrow, but something deeper. Something settled and quiet, forged through hunger and doubt and the long ache of learning to trust again. And in that moment, she knew. The man who once said no would never again refuse what truly mattered. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. What did you think of Elise and Lucien's journey? Was there a moment that touched your heart the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts, truly. Leave a comment below and let me know what moved you, what surprised you, or even what made you ache a little. I always enjoy reading your reflections, and your words help bring these stories to life for others too. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.